What's going on, gunfighters? You want to talk about reloading components? What's kind of the basic process of reloading? I'm going to try and talk through that today. Welcome to Gunfighter Life, the podcast where we talk about guns, gunfighting tactics, reloading, making ammunition, the right way with God Almighty at the center, biblical Judeo-Christian values, and real-world first-hand experience. On that, I normally mention military, law enforcement, private security, contracting, competition shooting, hunting. But today is about reloading. So my first exposure to reloading is 3-ish decades ago, 30-ish years ago. I have reloaded rifle, pistol, and shotgun. I have been blessed to win many competitions by God's grace, and many of those with ammunition that I reloaded. So there's some bona fides there for reloading. And if you haven't listened to Should I Reload, if you aren't already a reloader, you might want to listen to that episode. It might be worth your while. But I thought for those that are less familiar with reloading, we might go through the basic process of reloading and the components used along the way. And realize this is a complex topic. For those of you that are super OCD, I'm probably going to skip over some stuff. I'm probably going to say some stuff that, especially for the uber OCD guys, I'm going to drive crazy because I generally, I see rifles as tools or I see guns as tools to perform a task, for putting meat on the table, defending my family, to earn a paycheck by God's grace. I'm a private security contractor, currently the main breadwinning job by God's grace. So I see guns as tools. If you're super OCD and you water drop measure every case and have a, Foster coax press and you're super OCD about reloading, probably just skip this episode because I'm going to talk about the down and dirty, how to get it done. So with that, I'm going to go super basic. So I know this is kind of, tactical mansplaining to a lot of you, but not everybody pops out of their mom's womb knowing how a cartridge works. So the basic components of a cartridge, before we get started, you have your projectile, your bullet, your propellant, your powder, which is what gives you the energy, and your primer, which is what sets off the ignition of the explosive, or not the explosive, but the propellant. Gunpowder is actually not an explosive, it's propellant. And then you have the brass case. And the brass case is just basically what holds everything together. It makes it easy to transport and store and load from a magazine into a chamber, So those are the basic components. And the basic way that it works is a firing pin hits a primer. I don't care if you're talking about a single shot, falling block. I don't care if you're talking about, an AR-15 or a machine gun. They all basically put a cartridge in the chamber, and then a firing pin hits a primer. The firing pin hitting the primer initiates that chain reaction that sends that bullet out of the end of the barrel. When that's all said and done, whether you manually do it with a bolt action or a ejection rod or a revolver, or the firearm itself spits out the spent brass case, that brass case is there. And that's kind of the more complex, a lot of times can be one of the more complex and expensive parts of the ammunition. So why not reuse that? And so you could call it reloading or hand loading. Both terms work. So you're going to take that case now that you have. And you might not know this if you're not a reloader, but that brass case, generally we're talking brass cases here, because, let's take a 223 round. It has to fit into a bunch of different firearms, a bunch of different ARs, a bunch of different, from military M16s to, super tight civilian chambers. It has to fit into all those chambers. So there's going to be some tolerance variance there. Even in a match grade round, like a 6.5 Creedmoor, there's going to be some variance chamber to chamber. Well, that brass is going to expand to fit that chamber. If you want to fit it back into a bunch of different chambers, you have to resize it. It's going to have expanded a bit. And also the neck is going to have expanded. That neck was going to be tight to hold that bullet in place. When you fire it, it's going to open up to let that bullet out and to seal the chamber up. So for those reasons, you're going to have to resize that. So you're going to have to shove that brass case into something to resize it. And What generally does this is the press. It's called a press. It could be a single stage press. That's the main thing I'm going to talk about today, I think, because that's the easiest for beginners and the easiest to understand the process. Even if you have a bunch of progressive presses, I would encourage you to have a single stage press and start with a single stage press. Once you know everything, if you're getting back into it, then you might start with a progressive. But in general, if you've never reloaded, I'm going to tell you to get a single stage press. And that basically means you're just doing one kind of die set at a time. We'll get into dies right now. So you have your press. That's a machine that you shove the brass into your die. You're going to have 2 to 3 dies depending on what kind of cartridge it is. But in general, your first die is going to resize that brass. So you're going to turn it from the shape that it is now back into the original factory spec dimensions. And you're going to do that because brass is relatively soft. You're going to shove it up into the press and resize it with a resizing die that basically has all those proper dimensions in it. The brass, depending on the cartridge, may have gotten a little bit longer if you're talking about a high pressure like rifle cartridge. So you may want to trim that. And if you trim that, then it's going to get it back to the correct length so it fits into the chamber. If it's something like a 9mm 38 special, you're probably not worried about trimming it. And a lot of stuff you don't even have to trim every time. I know that just made some people gasp. Well, you're shooting 223 and you're picking up range brass that's factory new and you reload it one time because you get all the free brass you want. You probably don't have to worry about trimming it and all that stuff. But you might also trim it. And since you're shoving it up into the resizing die, you may also punch out that old primer. Obviously, the old primer is used. You need to put a new one in, so you'll punch out that old primer. Now, some people will do this as a separate step, and they'll do it before they do some other stuff. But in general, you'll do it now. And you'll punch out that old primer, and then you may want to clean the case. And again, the OCD guys may gasp at this, but you actually don't have to do this. You don't have to clean cases unless they're like covered in sand or grit or solvent or something. You don't have to polish your cases. You don't have to clean your cases. If they're just dirty, a little bit of tarnish, right? That's not going to hurt anything. If you shoot a load of 38 specials and you take them out of your cylinder and put them on a bench or put them in your pocket or whatever, and you go to reload them, they probably don't need to be cleaned. I know some people gasp at that, but you really don't need to. You might want to, and most people do, just to make sure there's no sand or grit or anything in there. But just realize that's an optional thing. You don't have to do it to get functional ammo. But you'll generally take that brass. You can clean it before or after you resize it, but throw it into the brass tumbler. It's just a machine that moves media around, corn cob or crushed walnut or something to clean that brass case. Now, you don't have to do any of this again, but if you do a cheap way to do this, you could just get an old like protein powder container from your working out, and you just shove some of that media in there, and you can just throw it in the back of your truck, the bed of your truck, and let it roll around as you're going around doing your daily commuting or whatever, and it can roll around back there and clean out your brass, so it doesn't have to be expensive. So now you've used that resizing decap or depriming die. You've got some fairly clean brass. Now what do you got to do? Now you got to put a new primer in it, right? Because if you don't do that first, the powder's going to fall out. Ask me how I know, but you're going to put a new primer in there. Sometimes there's hand priming tools. Sometimes you'll actually do this on the press with a little lever arm that comes in and out. But you'll generally, in one of those different ways, you'll put a new primer into the cartridge. There are a bunch of different kinds of primers. There's basically 2 sizes, large and small. If we don't talk about shotgun, there's 2 sizes, large and small. And then there's rifle, and then there's pistol, and then there's magnum and non-magnum. So you could have, let's say, a large magnum rifle primer on the top end, and you could have a small standard pistol primer on the small end, and any combination of those. And all your big names are going to make primers. Some other small names too, but like your Federal, Winchester, Remington, those are all going to make primers. So there's that. You've got your new primer, whatever you've selected for in your load data. You've got your new primer in there. Now you're going. Now you're going to put in powder. You can do this by hand with a little funnel with something simple like a powder dip measure, right? Which is basically a spoon. This is the simplest, easiest, cheapest way to do this. It measures by volume. You're generally going to, look at a chart and see what size spoon you're going to use. A lot of times they come in sets. They're super cheap. You can make your own, and then you can measure it by scale to see how much powder it's throwing. But this is a real simple, easy way to measure powder. You can just basically take a dipper, dip in your powder, take an index card or something and swipe it on the top so it's straight and level and plumb, and you get the same measurement every time. You're basically doing what an automatic powder measure does, but you're doing it manually. And you're going to take that with some kind of funnel or something and dump it into your case. Now your powder's in your case. You may want to go back and measure it to make sure it's correct, but now your powder is in your case. You're going to go consult your load data in your load manual or your chart on your online source and double check it. Measure twice, blow up none. If the measure twice, cut once is a thing for a carpenter, like measure twice and don't blow yourself up once, is probably a good adage for the reloader. But you're going to measure it, make sure it's good. If you're doing a bunch of cartridges, I suggest you measure when you start, and you measure your last case or midway through your cases to make sure that you're still throwing the same amount of powder. You haven't screwed something up and gotten distracted and made a mistake. But you'll look at your powder type. There's two big categories of powder. And there's a bunch of different powders, but two big categories of powder. There's your rifle powder, which is much slower burning, and there's your pistol shotgun powder. Most pistol and shotgun powders are like, you can use the same powder as pistol or shotgun, like Tight Group or 700X, 800X, green dot, blue dot, red dot. So you could use those for either or. Your rifle powders are just going to be for your rifle. And rifles are not nearly as forgiving. Like certain cartridges, you're going to take certain powders. You get a decent broad spectrum pistol powder. You can load a bunch of different pistols, maybe not all of them, but a lot of your common pistol ones. But you might use, different powders for different rifle cartridges, especially if you want to optimize it. But they're going to be slower burning powders. Those are things like, what's a classic one? H4350 or IMR 4350, 4831, Varget, CFE 223, Superformance. These are all like fairly common rifle powders. You're going to look at your reloading data and pick one of those. You're going to put that in the cartridge case. Now there are some 3-die sets, and again, I'm going to make a lot of people mad. You don't actually have to do this on a lot of cartridges, especially if you're not using like lead bullets, but there is a middle die that will expand the top of the brass to make like a very small, it's not quite a funnel, but it kind of does the same thing. It flares out the top of the brass so you can more easily seat a bullet. You may or may not have to do this. If you don't have to do it, my suggestion is just skip it. But your next step is to seat the bullet in there. For this, you have another die, which is called a seating die. This is basically just going to ensure that your bullet gets seated to the consistent depth. And what is this depth? Well, you'll get that again from your reloading data and manuals. It'll give you a COL, or cartridge overall length. This is the most basic form. There are more fancy things like ogive measuring and stuff, which don't worry about that if you don't know what it is. Just you're going to measure to make sure that your cartridge is the correct length. Might do stuff later, like if you want to optimize the jump from your bullet till it hits the rifling. But again, let's set that aside. For basic stuff, you're basically just seating your bullet to a consistent depth. And what you'll basically do is back out your resizing component of your die, and how to set all this up should be in your reloading manual. But you're going to screw down the die to the correct depth, your resizing die, and then you're going to back out that bullet seating die, and you're going to run it up in there until you just barely start to seat the bullet. Once you start to seat the bullet, you will determine how far you want to seat it, and you will, let's say, seat the bullet, measure it with calipers, another component, right? But it's just basically a very precise tape measure that measures how long your bullet is, right? You don't want to be doing this with a tape measure or a ruler. It's way more precise than that. So you need a micrometer. You need something very precise for measuring this. And you're going to run it up in there. Oh, it's too long. You're going to run it up in there again. It's too long. You're going to run it in there again. And it's the Goldilocks, right? It's just right. And that's your load. And that's basically it. You can throw a crimp on there. But again, if you don't have to, I generally don't bother. If it's something hard, like, when I'm reloading for my 454 Casull, that's a hard recoiling round than a light gun because it's a handgun. Yeah, I'll crimp those. But in general, if you don't have to, I wouldn't bother crimping. Just me. But you could also crimp, and that might be done on the same step, same press. When you see the bullet, it may also crimp it. Or you could do an extra step, a factory crimp die. Okay, so that's a lot of your components. So we've got the press, we've got the dies, we've got the powder measure. Whether it's a manual or a thing, you'll have a powder scale to measure it. You'll have a micrometer to measure the lengths of the cartridge. And the big thing that I mentioned several times, but I will mention specifically here, is your load manuals, right? So you're going to want a good, even if you have all the internet and you got Wi-Fi and you're on the grid and all that stuff, I still suggest you have a good load manual. And a bunch of the big companies make them, right? Hornady, Winchester, actually I don't know if Winchester's about IMR, Hodgdon, they do a lot of load data. They're your best online data source for like the most loads, most powders, I think, at least that are common and free, is going to be the Hodgdon. I think that's spelled Hodgeon. Anyway, you type it in, it'll be close enough. You'll probably be able to find it. There's a lot of load data there, but get yourself a good manual. Spear makes a good load manual. I think, who else is a big one? Lyman, you might find those. So Lee also makes a good one, and Lee makes a lot of the more affordable die sets and reloading components. If I'll just talk briefly about some of the companies that do the reloading stuff, your budget ones are going to be Lee. They're very good. They're like your very basic budget entry level. They're still very good, but they make presses, they make dies. And then there's also RCBS. They're kind of the like old school standard, middle of the road, rock solid presses, dies. Nothing real fancy, but they get the job done. They'll last if you take care of them for generations. There's also Lyman. There's Hornady. There's Franklin. They're new to the game, but they seem decent. And there's maybe some other ones that I'm forgetting. One of the big things you should know is that most of the presses and dies are going to use the same thread. So don't think that if you get, Lee dies, you have to get a Lee press. You could get an RCBS press and Lee dies. Or you could get a Lyman dies and, Lee press. So don't think that you have to stick with one or the other. Don't think that if you get a Hornady press, you have to get a Hornady dies. You don't. It doesn't really matter. Unless there's some weird older thing I'm not familiar with, they all have the same thread pitch. They're all a standard thread pitch for seating your dies into the press. The actual internals of the die may be different, but for screwing a die into a press, they're all basically the same. Some fancier presses will have like quick change systems or complete turret systems. A turret reloading press is kind of halfway between a progressive press and a single stage press, where you're still doing one operation at a time, but instead of actually taking the die out of the press, you can just turn the turret and put a different die indexed onto your RAM. So I know that long form audio is not the best for this, but once you see a video or two or see somebody set up, you'll probably understand what I'm talking about. So with that, trying to think if there's anything else that I've forgotten. Just be safe. Make sure you understand what you're doing. If you have somebody that can mentor you, I would try and get them to mentor you in the reloading and the reloading components. For the reloading components on the bullets, because that's a big variable, it depends on what you want to do, right? We talk about components. If you just want to shoot cheaply and it's a low pressure round, for most things you could cast your own lead bullets. If you have a very affordable or free source of lead, like you got a buddy who owns a tire shop, maybe you can get, the wheel weights for free, and you got a free source of lead. If you're doing something like 38 Special or a real low pressure round, ancient 4570, right, you can make your own bullets, and it will be quite a bit cheaper. So there's that. It's just basic lead bullets. If you want something that's a little bit less dirty to work on, because I shoot a lot and I train a lot and I handle guns a lot, I try to minimize my lead exposure. I've had my lead tested. I'm fine, but like I've been a professional gunfighter most of my adult life. That is something that I'm a little bit concerned about, just to keep an eye on. So a way to do that if you want to shoot cheaply can be the plastic coated lead bullets. There's some kind of polymer or film on the lead bullets just to minimize lead exposure. There's also what may appear to you to be full metal jacket bullets, but they're actually just copper plated. The copper plating is much thinner and therefore more affordable process, It's basically just a lead bullet with a copper plating, which again is much thinner. Companies like Barry's Bullets or Extreme Bullets will have these. They're a good way to, one, minimize your lead exposure and make guns easier to clean. You'll see these in handguns and lower velocity rifle rounds, but more prevalent in the handgun world. And then you move up to your standard full metal jackets for rifles, right? If you are just practicing or just shooting steel, then it doesn't really matter, what the bullet does once it gets to the target. So full metal jackets are good for affordable practice. If you're going for extreme accuracy, you're going to want like a match type bullet. If you are going for hunting or terminal performance, you're going to want a tailor-made bullet for that, right? You don't want to be reloading your full metal jackets for defense. You're going to want to get a good, what's a classic, Nosler partition or an Accubond or, ballistic silver tip or whatever the case is, that is tailored for that thing. So just be mindful of that. Make sure the projectile matches what you're trying to do. Also make sure that your primers, which we briefly talked about, look at your load data for the primers. If the load data calls for a certain primer, then you are not necessarily married to that primer, but you should look there first, and you should not get up towards the upper end of your load and then switch out the primer. You should back it off if you're going to do that. Now, one thing that I will say about primers, there are softer primers and harder primers in my experience and in competition shooting. Federal generally makes the softest primers. So if you're doing a gun that's had trigger work on it, or you may have, a less inertia in the firing pin system, and some guns do and some guns don't, you may want to shoot a Federal. If you're going for absolute reliability, you may want to go for a Federal primer. But if you're going for like rugged ammo, like you're a prepper, you're a survivalist, and I don't shy away from either one of those terms, you may want a really hard primer, like a Winchester primer or even a NATO primer. They even make NATO primers that are like meant to be hard for the ammo getting slammed around, beat around. So just realize that primer hardness is a thing as well. Also, don't think that if you're reloading, you want a Magnum primer. Don't be like, I'm gonna Magnum my standard cartridge by putting a Magnum primer in there. That's not how that works. I've tested some of this a long time ago where I had a standard cartridge or like a Magnum cartridge, and I would put in a Magnum primer, and I'd actually get less velocity than I would with a standard primer. So don't assume, right? Don't be like, I'm gonna make my, what's a good example? I'm going to make my 308 a Magnum because I'm going to put in a Magnum rifle primer. Nope, that's not how that works, and it could be dangerous, so don't do that, right? If it calls for a standard primer, use a standard primer. If it calls for a Magnum primer, use a Magnum primer. We talked about powders briefly, rifle powders, pistol and shotgun powders. There are some more specialty powders. One big one is temperature stable powder for a rifle. So if you're going to be elk hunting, and you could be elk hunting in 80 degrees or you could be elk hunting in minus 20 degrees, there are more temperature stable powders, meaning your velocity will not fluctuate as much with those powders. That may be something you care about, maybe not, right? You maybe don't care about that at all. Another one would be copper fouling eraser powder. There's a few of these, CFE pistol, CFE 223, where it knocks back the copper fouling in your barrel. If you do a lot of barrel cleaning, you may realize that copper is kind of a pain in the butt to get out of a lot of barrels. So those are things you might be concerned about. And besides the copper fouling, you may just find that certain powders burn way cleaner than others. Maybe you don't care about this. Maybe you just care most about accuracy. But like, let's say you're doing pistol competition shooting, and you may shoot a couple hundred rounds in a day. Well, you may find that with one powder, your handgun just gets filthy, and you start running into reliability issues. With another powder, you barely notice it after 200-300 rounds because it's still very, very clean. Easy way to test this is to look inside your brass after you fire it and see how clean the brass is. Some brass will be almost can't tell you fired it, and some will just be just nasty and filthy. So the cleanliness of the powder in that loadout of your gun is also kind of important. What else here? I could probably talk about this all day, but I don't want to overwhelm you if you are new to this game. Just kind of a basics on reloading components and cartridge components. I hope that this was helpful. And your tactical verse of the day, I'm just going to knock out some of the 10 commandments, starting with number 6. You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, nor his male servant, nor his female servant, nor his ox, nor his donkey, nor anything that is your neighbor's. Those are commandments 6 through 10. With that, guys, thanks for listening, and have a blessed day.